so much of what we've done in construction is really delivered information down and trained very prescriptively of like, this is how you get this thing done, as opposed to, hey, here's this thing that needs to be done and why it needs to be done. You tell us how to get it done, and almost put it back into the hands of the younger generation that have all these tools in front of them. Like, I think a lot of that's the teaching moment there, is how do we set up these scenarios that are less, I'm going to tell you how to do it and you go do it and write these 1,000 questions, versus more, here's the outcome that we need and you figure out the most innovative way to get there.
Yeah. And, there's a legal side and a risk side to what you just said. And I think the way we look at risk, and unfortunately, a lot of the way risk is operationalized is what claims have been settled and what lawyers are out there that can actually defend a thing. So I think one of the things that'll slow some of the freedom you just talked about is this idea of how are we managing risk, which is it's an absolutely valid point, and I totally see that happening. That you'll open up problem solving in a way that wasn't true before, when everything had to be documented because everything was paper, and now you don't need to document quite the same because you can audit what people did digitally. The degree to which that will reflect itself, I think it absolutely will happen. We're just going to have to think about how to defend that legally. And it's a little bit incumbent on software providers to create that audit trail and to record what's going on. And I think you'll start to see that. I'm hearing it more and more, is that people think about, how is my software creating a new standard of care? And if so, how am I making sure I'm not creating new risks? You know what I mean? And that's a big one. And I think between documentation and the things you choose to save and the things you choose to allow to be permanently deleted, you can really think about how you're changing or maintaining or reducing the risk profile of your customer. It's not easy. It's like anything else. It takes a lot of work.
It takes a lot of work, a lot of care, but this is the interesting part too, because if you listen back in the shows, we had Rose Hall on, and I had her on stage at the AGC National Convention this year with Rick Kahn, and we talked about the interesting part of risk is that's where the money's made. If you know your risk profile and know what you're good at, you have an opportunity to raise your profitability by understanding your risk tolerance and where you can do that. And what you're talking about, both of you, is a convergence of the technologies. When you talk about, upfront building information modeling and VDC, you talk about reality capture mixed with computer vision and all of the ways that we can see the site, all the ways that we can now look at the documentation up front and the specs and the designs. We can start focusing on where we're really good at managing that risk and removing it. But then also, Nathan, to something you've always talked about, is we can change the experience, right? Because if we have the bots doing a lot of the checking, doing a lot of the paperwork that you're talking about, Hugh, and the documentation, or at least we're doing that in a better level, then we can focus on the experience. Right. The AI, if I tell it to generate something cool, which I heard from a person recently where a group of people had some money and they wanted to build something and they said, it has to be spectacular. The AI is not going to come up with that. Right. It might, but it would be interesting and probably not close to what the group of people in that room wanted.
Or constructible.
Or constructible, right? And that team gets to now focus on the process of bringing an experience to life, bringing a building, bringing a feature, bringing something to life, and, frankly, making more profit on it if you do it right. So I love the convergence of all this technology, really opening us up for creativity. And to Nathan's point earlier, like, hey, here it is. And Hugh, can you imagine, like, when we're capable of handing it over and knowing the specs are covered, the clauses in the contracts are covered, people have got their butts covered, and everybody's ready to go? That's awesome.
Yeah, I think it will boil down to what kind of building you're talking about. So buildings that you do a lot of, I think, will be faster because it'll be error checking and it'll have a lot to compare against. I think there's always going to be a need for judgment. Certainly for certain buildings that are unusual or, mission critical, whatever it might be. You can raise your prices based on a risk profile. And I think one of the things that we don't talk about as much as we might in construction is competitiveness, not at a how am I bidding, but how am I doing business level. And if you're able to use the technologies we're talking about, increase your ability to manage risk, but the market price for that amount of risk is set by the market, you're able to increase your profits. So, and there's no better way to compete than being more profitable than someone else, because you can invest in all the other things that make you competitive. So I think that there's an interesting perspective around, ability to really lock down risk and still charge what the market charges, or charge a little less, but not give away all your margin, which is another thing that contractors are kind of not so great at, is they compete away their own margins.